Hi, my name is Georg Wicherski. I work for CrowdStrike, an American startup, as a manager of information dominance, and that's what happens when you can choose your job title on your own. Today I will be talking about building a reasonably safe travel burner laptop. So yeah, we will talk about threat models, and basically it's a big commercial for Chromebook hardware, because that's what we'll be using for this. My background, where I'm coming from, is that at my company I'm also responsible for operational security and deployments and so on. And yeah, let's talk about why would one need a secure laptop in the first place, right? So it all started with my awareness being very naive, and before the Snowden slides and stuff were released. It all started with me with a story from a friend a couple of years ago who was traveling to the Black Hat conference in Vegas in the United States. And he is not an American citizen, and he's also not one of these privileged Western European citizens, but from somewhere else. And he was going through immigration, and then he was told that his laptop had to be X-rayed for some random reason. The X-ray took on and went on and went on, and it went on for 2.5 hours. So that's a very, very good in-depth X-ray. And this is not his laptop, this is just a random picture. So one may wonder what parts they X-rayed for so long, right? And back then he was already saying, well, it didn't really matter to me because it wasn't even encrypted. It was just something I brought along for taking notes and so on. But he threw it away after the trip for obvious reasons, right? Now, trigger warning for anybody who has a top secret clearance in the US, you may want to leave the room now. Now, the Snowden slides have been released. Yeah, we know what stuff is going on in these scenarios, right? And of course, there was proof for this as well before. But these are two slides from the end product catalog, which is basically NSA's internal product catalog, what they can offer to their customers, if you will. And these two products here are basically related to infection of the boot chain. And the specific one is software implant for the master boot record, colloquially also known as a bootkit. And the other one is modification to the hard disk firmware, which will basically carry out the same MBR modification, but from the hard disk firmware, so it's more persistent and more stealthy. And these are only two ways to hijack the boot sequence, right? We know that if you have a laptop that boots, there are so many things involved before you're actually on your desktop in your operating system. And that's so many things that are outside of your full disk encryption that are actually executing before that kicks in. Which basically means that they may not be able to grab a disk dump of your drive at the border because it's encrypted, but they may well be able to actually deploy some implant, and once you are so nice to unlock your hard disk for them, they can then access the unencrypted contents of your disk drive based on the same simple access at the border. And it's very nice for all these people because, you know, you're used to going through borders. They have trained everybody very well with the TSA procedures and so on, that there will be a lot of investigations at borders. You are asked questions by custom officers. Sometimes your stuff gets X-rayed, right? So people are getting used to this, and it's a lot easier to actually access some laptop when you're crossing a border than accessing it while it's sitting on your home, right? Because then somebody needs to break into your home. You need different kinds of warrants for that. It's more work involved, and it's much easier to get caught, right? And even though I'm taking here the NSA slides because they got leaked, they're the poor guys who had all their stuff leaked. I'm not saying the Americans are the only ones doing this. I'm German, and we had a case from Germany where it's more or less proven based on the stuff that was released in court, where law enforcement interdicted a drug trafficker's laptop and an airport border crossing entering Germany to deploy a software implant to decrypt Skype traffic, basically by capturing audio before it's encrypted by Skype. Also because Germany doesn't have the luxury to be able to, you know, serve Skype warrants to decrypt stuff and serve user data. They tackle this in a different way, right? It's the same thing. They access it at the border because it's very convenient, especially if you look at drug people. If you take his laptop away at the border, you will be not as suspicious as an Infosec person maybe, right? That's the Germans. And of course, the Russians are doing this as well. The Chinese are doing this. A lot of companies have procedures to weigh laptops. When you go to China and when you return from China, you weigh your laptops to figure out if somebody put some hardware implant in there, which is, I don't know, of dubious utility because, you know, you wouldn't put a 2-kilogram hardware brick into a MacBook Air maybe for backdooring it. But people are concerned about this, and of course this is happening. And yeah, for various reasons, right? The Five Eyes always say they're after terrorists, the Germans are after drug traffickers, other countries are after are after economic espionage. That was a Freudian slip. And I don't want to blame any country here specifically. They're all equally good or bad. But no matter which borders you cross, there's a risk of people accessing a laptop. And then also people stay at hotels for conferences, and you know, entering hotel rooms and opening hotel safes is trivial. And I remember 2 or 3 years ago there was a fire alarm here where basically all the attendees went outside at this conference in this hotel, and I had my laptop bag on me, but I saw a lot of people that actually didn't have the laptop bags on them because it's a fire alarm, right? It turned out to be a false alarm, surprise, but yeah. I'm not saying the Finnish are behind this. Just saying it happens here. So looking at secure ecosystems, there's basically two very public major ecosystems that are very safe in regards to their boot chain. One is iOS, which I just leave out here because I don't want to be fiddling with an iPad or something, and OS X doesn't benefit from the same boot chain security. And the other one is Chrome OS. If you actually look at Chromebooks and the Chrome OS stuff that's on there, and if you look actually at the excellent public documentation Google is publishing about this themselves, they have a very good security model around their boot chain and so on. The big problem of using that as it comes is that, well, you get Chrome OS, which is basically a very thin client around Google Web Services. And this can be problematic for two reasons. That's very useless for the average Infosec person. You can use Gmail, but you cannot properly use PGP around this, for example. You can use Google Docs, but you know, there's no compiler and so on. I actually know some Google people who use Chromebooks for everything they do with the lockdown Chrome OS, and was like, you can actually develop on that? Yeah, of course, we can do anything on this. And then I actually looked at how they're doing it, and they're always SSHing into a server to do everything on the server over a shell, so it's kind of pointless, right? And the other big disadvantage is, of course, if you, for some reason, are suspicious that some Five Eyes intelligence agency may be after you, or the FBI or whoever, of course, Google is a company subject to US law. I want to give them some credit. They have huge armies of lawyers always trying to fight anytime the government wants to impose some new tapping and stuff on them. But of course, the government makes the law, and in the end, if you're an activist, in Yemen, for example, you may decide that using Chrome OS as it is not the best solution for you. So they make a very nice example. It's all open source and public, but yeah, you get Chrome OS in the end, which is not useful for everybody. So what else do we have in terms of existing solutions for securing your boot chain? There's a couple of solutions. Actually, Joanna Rutkowska published a paper 2 days ago, I believe, which will tell you why all of these solutions are terribly broken. I made the slides before that, and I only have a very small excerpt from, you know, one of the things. For example, UEFI Secure Boot, which is a thing where you can actually put your own public key into your BIOS and say only boot stuff that's signed with this key. The problem with UEFI, for example, is UEFI is so huge and it's riddled with vulnerabilities. So it's very, very easy to actually, you know, find a vulnerability in parsing of on-disk data structures and so on that will give you code execution at boot, thereby nullifying the whole thing. Intel Boot Guard is also interesting because, you know, it has the same thing of signatures, but this one is realized actually by some security processor on the system on chip, so it's not subject to the whole BIOS vendor stuff and so on. But then you have to have a vendor who's actually signing stuff for you, and you know, when they're signing stuff, it's not so great. We want to build something where only you have the keys for it, right? So there's Google Verified Boot, which is actually, or vboot, which is part of that secure Chrome OS booting sequence, which is open source, which is kind of nice. You could think about adapting that. The problem is that it's really, really geared heavily towards booting Chrome OS. So they have, in the end, it consists of parsing a binary blob, which then contains the Chrome OS kernel and depth charge, which is their bootloader and so on. So it's not so easy to adapt. And also, every time Google open sources something, that means the source is public, but you cannot actually build it because the stuff that they publish doesn't have any working build system. And every Google engineer will actually acknowledge that, Google open source repositories are never what Google people build from, because they always have internal repositories. And they just push some snapshots of these into public JIT repositories to comply with GPL, right? Sorry if you're looking at me like this is wrong, but yeah, so.
I don't work there.
I call it pseudo open source because it is open source, but you cannot actually build it, right? And yeah, we want something open source, so UEFI Secure Boot and BootGuard and so on are not applicable, because if it's open source, at least hypothetically, somebody can audit it, right? We've seen with OpenSSL and so on that actually doesn't happen. But if we have open source, we could audit it ourselves more easily than reverse engineering some obscure security coprocessor stuff and so on. The other requirement for building something is it should still be cheap, because we may assume that we have something that is somewhat secure for some trip. Then we can maybe even see that somebody tried to put an implant in there on a trip. If that happens, we don't want to go through super long forensic to determine if actually something was compromised. If there's the slightest suspicion of compromise, just throw it away. And for me, that means it should be cheaper than $300 for such a device, right? I mean, it depends on how often you travel and who you are in the company. I mean, our CEOs, they have throwaway MacBook Airs and so on, but not everybody is in that position, right? An additional advantage would be if what we're building is public and diversified, because if there's a single solution, like if you have a black phone, then some government agency will say like, okay, we'll support black phones now. They're all the same, right? Whereas when you start building something that is diversified, it's open source, people customize it, then it becomes very difficult to attack this as one thing. So, if it's open source, you can put your unique personalized element in it. I don't know, put a picture of your family in the boot sequence as splash screen, and then somebody will have a hard time flashing a ROM image that actually has that picture in it, right? If they know that you actually do this in the first place. And then, of course, you can go with other stuff than only personalization in terms of splash screens and so on. So what did I build and how did I design it, and what's my threat model? First, some credit where credit is due. This all wouldn't be possible without the COREBOOT project. If you're not familiar with COREBOOT, it's actually an open source BIOS implementation, if you will. They always will tell you it's not a BIOS because they do all the hardware initialization. But they don't actually do like the stuff that like something like press escape to boot this device and so on. The whole user interaction and so on, something that they defer to what the payload is. So it's basically hardware initialization code that's normally part of the BIOS. And they're a very, very supportive community. They were very helpful in helping me actually build what I wanted to build. So I want to give credit to the entire community, and also to Kiesti Malki. It's a Finnish guy. I have trouble pronouncing Finnish names. Who was of particular help in developing my stuff. So actually, if you look for people who help you building your own secure laptop, there's a guy in Espoo who can do that for you. So let's talk about the design. All these new mainboards that you have these days, they have what is called an SPI flash, which is also known as EEPROM, which is not actually like physically a ROM chip or electrically erasable ROM chip like in the old days, or just called ROM or whatever. It's a small storage chip, typically these days 8 megabytes in size, on your mainboard that stores like the system firmware and the BIOS and so on that is kicked off at boot. So that's SPI flash. And in this design, we will make this SPI flash the root of our chain of trust. So if somebody changes the SPI flash chip on your mainboard by desoldering it and putting another one on it, then you basically still fuck. But then you're at the point where somebody says, well, they can just put a different mainboard in there and put it in the same case, or they can give you a different laptop and you think it's still yours. At some point, you have to create your threat model around that, right? What we will not trust is like the SSD or HDD or whatever you have on a laptop, because that's trivial to swap out and replace and implant and whatnot. Especially the firmware on those is also not verified and easy to reflash. As we've seen in the AND catalog, they have capabilities around that. So on the SPI flash, there will be COREBOOT, which is basically once you power on your laptop, the processor jumps to a special address at the end of your ROM flash and it starts executing code there. And this is COREBOOT, which will take care of the hardware initialization, which is actually very difficult. When I started with this, I wasn't even aware that when this stuff starts executing, there is no memory present, so to speak, to the processor yet, which is called the ROM stage. It's pretty interesting also how you develop code for that, because there is no stack. There's no memory, right? So you cannot actually call functions. You can only do jumps and chain jumps and so on. And this will then initialize the memory. And there's like a complicated step that's called memory training, because modern memory is fast and not complicated. So there's actually huge amounts of code that take care of initializing your memory and so on. All that has been solved by COREBOOT for us, luckily. And then as a payload for COREBOOT, because as I said, COREBOOT only does hardware initialization, we will use grub2. Those familiar with grub know that it's great bootloader to put on your disk drive to boot Linux, but actually grub can also be used as a COREBOOT payload on your SPI flash. So after powering on your laptop, you will immediately see the grub choice and so on. And grub is very interesting because, well, grub is a huge monolithic thing. Some people say even, it's almost too complex for a bootloader these days. There's a lot of modules in grub too that you can use. And what's interesting here for us is there's also modules for LUKS full disk encryption. So you can actually now encrypt the entire disk, including your boot partition, including your boot sector. And the other thing is that they have what is called verify modules, which basically can verify the RSA signature of something. So you can sign your kernel, you can sign your init RAMFS, which is like the initial system that gets booted, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then the only thing left on your disk drive is a boot partition, which contains your kernel and what you want to boot. Well, if you didn't figure yet, I'm trying to build something that boots Linux. Windows is pretty much out of scope here for open source stuff, right? But these are signed with an RSA signature, and obviously, you hold the private key to signing your kernels that you're deploying somewhere home, and don't take that traveling with you, right? And then you can also have on the disk drive, of course, your root file system, which may be encrypted or not encrypted. You can have your data home partition, which can be encrypted or should be encrypted probably. The root file system does not necessarily need to be encrypted if you don't want to hide what programs you have installed, because part of the design is also using DMVerity, which is a disk mapper target, to assure the integrity of your root file system. So basically what you're trying to do is your entire user space file system is also signed with your private key. Because signing every file and verifying RSA over all these is very inefficient. This DMVerity takes an entirely different approach. It's basically a hash tree over all blocks of your file system. And the root hash of this hash tree is then the only thing that is signed, and signed as part of your init RAMFS or wherever you put that root hash. And then by inference, your entire user space is signed as well. And this is also interesting from a threat modeling perspective, because if you do this and make you end up with a read-only root file system that gets like restored on every reboot, unless somebody has a kernel exploit and writes other blocks to the file system, but then it won't verify anymore. Well, okay. My laptop is a bit power conservative, sorry. Yeah, this also protects you against persistence and software exploitation. So even if you're not traveling with your laptop, but browsing untrusted websites, somebody has a browser exploit, they will have a hard time storing an implant persistently on your laptop, because everything's signed and they cannot reproduce the signature remotely. So we have our root of our chain of trust, and yeah, as I said, pretty much everything breaks if they have the capability to reflash your flash chip. So it's rather easy to reflash the flash chip. You need a clip and a device, and then you can write to it. And while there's flash chips that can be actually made read-only with special fuses at some point, those you don't typically find in your main board. And most people don't want to, desolder the flash chip and solder a special one and blow a fuse to make it read-only. There is, however, some non-volatile protection, which isn't a fuse, because if you pull to high voltage to VCC a certain pin, you can always reset the setting again. But the interesting fact is that this is the so-called write protect pin. The way that these flash chips are used in mainboards, this pin is only really used as a write protect pin and not for communication. So very simple thing is set this non-volatile protection, which will remain across power offs and so on, and then make it impossible to pull this write protect pin high by removing the pin. So a very simple approach. And if you some people have proposed pulling this pin to ground by, adding some solder, which makes sense because then, at least from the operating system, you cannot do this over GPIOs anymore. You cannot pull this pin high anymore because it's pulled to ground. But of course, somebody who can attach a clip to your flash chip, they can also remove the solder, pulling it to ground. By physically removing the pin, you can, try to make it read-only. And of course, if you don't want to be so with like tiny pins and working with this and so on, you can just take like some epoxy and cover everything in epoxy, and they cannot attach a clip anymore without removing the epoxy and then probably leaving some visible traces on your mainboard, right? That all being also under the threat model again, that they have some idea what they should be flashing, right? Since we're saying we're building something, every one of these is a unique snowflake because it's open source, people can customize it. They don't know what to actually flash on the chip to make it look like it looked before and still allowing them to load their implant, right? One thing I should mention is that actually there in the specifications for these chips, it says to quadruple the speed, you can use the write protect pin also as a transfer pin for transferring out data. So you can configure pins to have multiple data lines and thereby even take it to quad SPI speed, as it is called. But I looked at some laptops, especially those that I'm targeting here with a logic analyzer, and it seems none of the mainboards actually attempts to do this. So it's safe to remove that pin. It won't break your laptop anymore. So what hardware is what did I use for my proof of concept, and what did I build it on? We're looking at not your average big data analysis workstation, right? We want a lightweight travel laptop. So what I was looking at was these cheap Acer Chromebooks here. They're like C720 or C740. They're available new for about $250 on Amazon. If you go to eBay and buy one used, then you can get them for $150. And I don't want to make any statement towards the usability of Chromebooks, but I found that it's very easy to find on eBay almost unused devices. Like, people buy them, they figure out, that's not for me, and they sell them, and you get a much cheaper price. And yeah, like you often see stuff like, yeah, my son had this laptop for university, now he needs to use Windows, so we're selling this, for example, and stuff like this. And unfortunately, most of them only have 2 gigabytes of RAM on them, and they're also soldered onto the board, so you cannot upgrade them easily. There is 4 gigabyte models, but as all cool hardware, only sold in the US. So us Europeans are very unlucky. But you can get them off eBay because people are like, I bought this Chromebook in the US, bought it home, and I figured out I cannot run Windows, so I'm selling it on eBay, right? They also run pretty weak processors, which is some Celeron, which is the new one, the C740 is Broadwell generation SoC, but it is a Celeron processor. And this is pretty significant because these Celerons, they don't support the AES and next instruct, whatever it stands for, these hardware AES instructions. So that means if you actually encrypt your entire root file system, including all the binaries, performance-wise, it's okay, but there's a huge battery drain because all the full disk encryption will be in software. So it is advisable to actually only encrypt your home partition and work with DM-Verity to actually make sure that your root file system's integrity is protected even if it's not encrypted, right? There is i3 models, again, only sold in the US, which would be interesting because they have, at least of the C720, because they have AES instructions and hardware. I never got my hands on one of them. There is rumors that they don't actually work with COREBOOT. And yeah, so that's something to try out in the future. And they have one of these tiny next generation form factor SSDs in them, which are usable usually 16 or 32 gigabytes, because Chrome OS is a cloud system, operating system. You don't actually need local storage there, right? But you can upgrade them by just buying one of these M2 cards. And this is the stuff that I targeted for two very simple reasons. As I said, Chrome booting actually uses COREBOOT by default. So you theoretically get COREBOOT supported by buying this hardware. If you buy a Chromebook, it should support COREBOOT. The problem there is, as I said, it's Google open source, right? It's not necessarily working with upstream COREBOOT. But I've been working on that, and I'll talk about that later. And as I said, the other reason is they're readily available from Amazon or Newegg or eBay and cheap to throw away. Oh yeah, I also did a proof of concept on an old C7 or C710. Those are much nicer because, as you can see, you can actually have like a 2.5-inch hard disk to upgrade, and you have normal laptop DIMM slots where you can upgrade them. But this is 2012 hardware. It's a lot bulkier. And this year, what I'm presenting on is actually one of these C710 Parrot devices. So a little bit easier to upgrade, but yeah, a little bit older and bulkier. Oh, and also I should say with those, you can upgrade the battery. So you can have like a huge bulky battery. But if you actually have a low power setup, you can get like 12 to 14 hours of runtime with this. Yeah, so this is the Peppy board. Which is the C720. The way this basically works is Google has these reference mainboards that then vendors slightly adapt and put in these things. And what you see here is actually where the flash chip lives on this device. I don't know if you can read it on the image, but this is a Winbond flash chip, 8 megabytes. So, whoops, should be plenty of storage for a thing. And this is what it looks like from the inside. There's a lot of space for the battery, and the mainboard is actually rather small. And this is where you have the 2 gigabytes of memory. As you can see, they actually have only one mainboard, and they will just not solder the other memory to the mainboard if you get the small version. And this is the Auron Pain, which is a C740, which looks almost exactly the same, except on the other side here's the processor, which they upgraded for one more generation. And it has a very similar flash chip here. And this is significant because these are exposed flash chips, if you will. You can actually see the pins, you can access them, you can clip something onto them to reflash them. There is also packages of these flash chips that are like BGA soldered, and then you have no way to actually attach these traces. But these boards have accessible flash chips here. So what you probably will need for doing this is an external SPI flasher, because these laptops have the capability to reflash the BIOS if you actually put in a special jumper that pulls high the write protect pin. You can reflash from inside the laptop. The problem is if you do it wrong, if you screw something up, you break your laptop and you cannot flash it from inside anymore. So you probably want to have an external flasher to recover that. I started out with the Bus Pirate, which is very well known and famous, and it's also insanely slow for writing an SPI flash. So a full write cycle took me more than 30 minutes, which is, if you actually develop stuff, is taking forever. So I was actually working on 2 projects. Whenever I was flashing something, I was working on something else. But what I found is actually Adafruit has a FT232H breakout board, so that's an FTDI chip for $15, so 15 euro if you buy them in Europe. And they are very fast at flashing. So with that, flash cycle takes about 2 to 3 minutes because they can talk full speed SPI over USB. Whereas the Bus Pirate actually emulates a serial console, so you're actually the bottleneck is the serial console's baud rate when flashing stuff. The other thing that I bought is from AliExpress, super cheap for €6, just a clip to put it on the flash because I'm really bad at soldering, and I have some small probes, but it's a lot of work to attach the probes to each pin every time. And the clip, you just clip it on and connect it, and you're ready to flash. And I had some random 3.3 volt power supply lying around. And then here is the magic command line for using FLASHUM. And this is what it actually looks like. So I'm not very good at soldering and stuff, but I can just use jumper wires to connect pins on breakout boards. So you don't need to have a lot of hardware hacking experience to build one of these flashes yourself. And you can find documentation on the internet. So that's for flashing the ROM. The other thing that you may need if you start hacking on COREBOOT is USB-based NULL modem for the COREBOOT console. So COREBOOT can actually have a serial console, and it's pre-RAM. So actually from the ROM stage, which I found was very impressive. So before there's any memory, your COREBOOT can actually start talking to you already. Funnily enough, randomly the same Adafruit breakout board I chose for building the flasher also is supported, and I learned that later, for building a NULL modem cable. So COREBOOT in the ROM stage actually has a USB driver that can talk to this specific family of chips to do a serial console over USB with them. And then you can just put on the other side just a generic other USB to serial converter to effectively build a NULL modem cable over USB. There's a special debug port that every mainboard apparently has that you have to use, because these special debug ports, they can actually work with a much simpler USB stack instead of requiring DMA and so on. They only support very small, up to 64-byte USB packets, but every mainboard has one of these, and you just have to, by trial and error, find the right one, and then with that one you can actually build such early debug. So yeah, I also have here in the slides for later which port to actually use, so you don't have to try all the ports and configurations. Because the nasty thing is you also have to configure which port you will be using when building COREBOOT, because it has to identify the right port to the controller. So you try a port, you rebuild it, you try the next port, takes a lot of time. And then you can just use screen or whatever to attach to your host sites, USB adapter to serial adapter, and you have a nice console to read everything from COREBOOT. So yeah, that's the tools that you need. The actual implementation that I did is first for COREBOOT, I'm using the upstream COREBOOT, so not any Google COREBOOT repository, because as I said, they're broken, but the upstream COREBOOT, and just using their GitHub version. And it was very surprising. Upstream COREBOOT actually supports the C710 and C720 laptops out of the box. So you actually check out JIT, you do make menu config, you set your mainboard and so on, you build something, and it actually works. Unfortunately, it didn't work for the C740 at all, and because that's the most recent one of those and the most available one, I actually ported the Google branch to COREBOOT upstream to make it supported there as well. And yeah, if you look at the original SPI flash image from Google, they're so nice to also put their configuration in there. So if you're familiar with the K-build or K-config build system from Linux kernels, you can have a configuration file that tells you all the build options and so on. And the Google ROM images also contain all the configurations options they chose for building COREBOOT. So it's very easy to replicate the setup. Also, you will need some binary blobs that are, for example, used for the processor initialization that are signed by Intel and so on. And you can extract all of those from the original ROMs. So you always need to dump a ROM first before you write it. Because due to licensing issues and NDAs and whatever, there's no, COREBOOT isn't allowed to distribute these blobs. And Google isn't allowed to distribute these blobs as standalone things and so on. So you actually have to go to the original thing that was on your ROM, extract the binary blobs, which are easily extractable, and then put them into a directory accessible by the COREBOOT build code. And then on the C740, there's even more binary blobs. There's something which is called the reference code, and there's a magic command for properly adding that I replicated there. So yeah, that's pretty complicated. If you actually did not take a copy of your flash before trying to build something new, you can go to Google. They have some recovery images for the flash. However, Google is not allowed to officially announce that these recovery images contain these binary blobs for some reason, but you actually can get them from there. And yeah, then I just made some tweaks to the configuration for our purposes. First, the Google configuration reserves little space in the flash for COREBOOT and its payload, because they actually bootstrap their own verified boot and so on, which has their own place in the flash. We just increase that to 4 megabytes COREBOOT file system so that we can put a really large grub2 image with all the models that we could ever want to use in there. And then, of course, we remove all the vboot stuff and the Chrome OS stuff that we don't need. And then you can just use grub2 to create an ELF binary from grub2 and actually put that as a payload into your COREBOOT. So COREBOOT and grub2 integrate very well. And the big reason for that is that one of the grub2 main authors is also a COREBOOT author. So there's nice synergies between these projects. Yeah, and for building grub2, again, I'm just using the upstream JIT-head. And you just invoke from configure and tell it that you're building for COREBOOT instead of building for master boot record or whatever architecture you're targeting. And then there's this grub make standalone command that will actually be built, which creates for you grub images that can go into COREBOOT. And yeah, just some command lines for your reference again. What is important here is we'll have our own grub configuration file. The grub configuration will be in the flash. So that's trusted, so to say. And we will, of course, have our public key for signing the kernel being part of the grub image in the flash as well. And there's no need to actually reduce the amount of modules that you're using from grub because it's all compressed and we have enough space for that anyway. And then you just have to write a grub configuration that has some super user configuration. So basically you can enter a password so that somebody pressing escape during your boot cannot suddenly start altering your kernel command line and so on. And the grub configuration will load the signing key. If you encrypt something, it will unlock the encryption. And then will load signed stuff from your boot partition for booting. So yeah, as I said, we want to have this DM Veritum set up so that we have the whole root file system verified. The way it works, as I said, is this hash tree over all of the disk blocks. Which is also really nice for detecting failing disks, because as soon as a disk block reads wrong, you get an alert that there's tampering, and then your kernel locks up. So there's the root hash of this whole hash tree is supplied per the kernel command line or initramfs, and the root hash is signed. So your entire root file system is trusted. And there's a tool called VERITAS setup. Whoops. That will compute the whole hash tree for you, so you don't actually have to do any magic there. It's all very well integrated. Yeah, as I said, you can have protection from border control agent, and you can have protection from software exploits to a certain extent in terms of persistence as well. So if somebody wants to get code execution persistent, it's the same threat model as with iOS. Untethered jailbreaks. They need to find a vulnerability in grub2 or somewhere else in our boot chain that they will exploit at every boot to get code execution during the boot chain, which is just raising the bar higher, right? So coming to a conclusion on this in discussion, yeah, as I said, diversity here is key. That's also the reason why I decided to publish. Morgan said earlier that I will probably not publish everything I'm doing because that waters down my own OPSEC. But actually the idea is if everybody runs around with those, then it's not suspicious anymore, right? It's the same thing with Tor and GPG before the Snowden revelations. Then it was kind of like terrorists use Tor. So if you use Tor, then you're a terrorist, right? No, everybody's using Tor and GPG, so it's fine. If somebody runs around with yeah, everyone's a terrorist. Okay, that's another point of seeing it. If I didn't publish it and somebody was now running around with one of these special Chromebooks, they probably knew that I gave it to him or we're friends and I told him how to do it and so on. If I tell everybody here now, suddenly everybody can start using them. And the other thing, of course, is these appliances at these borders, right? There is not like the super awesome NSA super hackers sitting in a dark room at the border and waiting for your laptop arrive, right? Because they have got better things to do. The reality is they will likely, contract a defense contractor to build some appliance, some box that they put at some airports, and then these have manuals for operators that say like plug this cable into this port and then attach this clip to this chip and so on, right? And then press implant, and this is what the appliance does. And if you have everybody do his own thing, they cannot build turnkey ready appliances for this anymore, right? Because if somebody may use, I don't know, GPT partitions on his hard drive. The next person uses MS-DOS partitions. The next person uses Logical Volume Manager. So all the grub configurations in the Flash are all different in how they load the operating system. And building an appliance that covers all these corner cases that grub covers is very hard. And it's very nice that grub is so monolithic and has so many modules built in, because there's so many ways by just changing the configuration file to make an appliance not be able to tackle these specific instances anymore. And yeah, you can even go further. Instead of using the grub2 text configuration, you can start modifying grub2 hardcode and see how it should load your stuff and so on, right? So then actually they would have, if they want to target, you have to put a reverse engineer there and take your laptop away for 2.5 hours, right? Which is enough for you to actually notice that something fishy is going on. And of course, the other thing that we want is to be cryptographically secure without implementation bugs, right? grub2 is a huge code base, COREBOOT is big, you know, kernel has vulnerabilities. Of course, it is hard to do this, but yeah, we try to limit the amount of bugs as much as possible. So if a lot of people use it and audit it, then it becomes more eyes on the shallow code base or whatever. There is a problem of binary blobs. So the Chromebooks, COREBOOT, there aren't pure or libre, as it's called, because there's binary blobs in there that are required to work. All the tinfoil hats I talk to, they always tell me that, well, there's a binary blob, there must be backdoors, otherwise they wouldn't keep it binary. Which is stupid because, you know, I mean, I work in a company where a lot of people do nothing but reverse engineering. So binary is, of course, nothing in terms of protecting against backdoors, right? Most of these binary blobs, they actually run on the x86 host processor, so reverse engineering them is rather easy. So you can look for the backdoors if you're really inclined to. But the other thing is, what's the attack surface for backdoors? Because these blobs are part of the very, very early hardware initialization, and they don't get any like hooks to execute again at a later point in time. So the only attack surface here is that if somebody wants to gain persistence with this implant, they have a backdoor to, even though we have our secure boot chaining process, to actually kick off execution of their implant at boot time with that backdoor in the binary blob. But it's fairly unlikely if you look at how early these binary blobs execute and what they're doing and so on. I mean, one of these binary blobs is the memory initialization, so, you know, pretty hard to bootstrap backdoor at that point. And there's like nothing that can do network communication and so on. Luckily, the embedded controller in the Chromebooks, the firmware for that is actually open source and written by Google. So I mean, every mainboard, every MacBook laptop these days, they have embedded controllers that take care of, you know, detecting when the lid is opened and closed, that convert the keyboard metrics, the keys you press, into scan codes for the actual operating system and so on. And this is great. This is the reverse of binary blobs. Usually the firmware controller and so on, and at least in all the MacBooks, is very opaque and protected, whereas the Chromebook embedded controller is open source, and it's easy to reflash that as well. So if somebody actually backdoors that instead of, you know, the main application processor, they don't actually can access your main memory. The only thing, I talked to Google engineers about this, is since they do the translation from keyboard metrics to scan codes, they can write a keylogger, but they have no way of actually exfiltrating this again, but by emulating key presses at some point in the operating system, so it's kind of hard. I mean, there is long wires in a mainboard, and you can probably build some fancy RF stuff to exfiltrate stuff at really low speeds. But yeah, then you have to somebody with an antenna sitting in the next room, and if that's your threat model, you have different problems. Also, Google Verified Boot assures the embedded controller integrity by, well, basically reflashing it every time it has the slightest stop that the embedded controller was changed. And that's something that the grub2 boot chain I built doesn't do yet. That's something to adapt. And of course, there's a very infamous Intel manageability engine in there. The Chromebook comes with this very small version, which doesn't include any remote management features and so on, so it's not hooked to your network card and so on. It has a very small attack surface in the laptops. Again, it could potentially be used for a persistence exploit for like untethering if somebody has ring 0 code execution again. But that would be a vulnerability and not a backdoor, right? And even though Intel ME is actually on some obscure embedded controller that is part of the main processor these days, and it is kind of obscure because it's actually compressed with an unknown compression dictionary. There is actually people who have reversed the compression of that firmware and started reverse engineering that firmware, looking for backdoors, looking for vulnerabilities in the remote management and so on. And I talked to them, did you find any backdoors yet? And yeah, sadly, they didn't find any yet. So it's
telling you.
yeah, of course. And yeah, so also this firmware is signed by Intel, and the processor will refuse if it isn't signed. So Intel would have to actually purposefully put a backdoor in there. And again, with a small attack surface, no network communications and so on, it's rather a small thing, but it's something to be aware of. So in terms of contribution, all the scripts and the README step-by-step guide and so on, I made available in a GitHub, which hopefully now should be available already. So there's like a README file with a step-by-step guide how to build the whole setup, the scripts for building some DM Verity stuff, and mounting this correctly at boot time, some example grub2 configurations and so on. This support for the C740 laptop is also, well, I wrote a patch and it's pending review by the COREBOOT people. And I hope it will be integrated in upstream soon. Turns out COREBOOT is very, very rigorous about what code they accept. So they have like multiple nationals that review code that goes into COREBOOT. They have somebody who takes care of that you use tabs instead of white space and so on. So there's actually a lot of review on these patches, and there's some criticism to my patch which I will have to fix, and then hopefully soon we will have that model supported upstream as well. And yeah, the main conclusion here, of course, is the whole trusted boot chain doesn't have to be expensive at all. I must admit that I cheated. There was a COREBOOT conference in Germany 4 weeks ago, and I went there and sat with the developers, including grub2 developers in the room, and could ask them questions, and they helped me out actually starting off with my port and so on. But it was still less than 3 personal weeks that I actually wrote code and tried stuff. So it's actually a very, very reasonably doable project to do in your own organization from scratch. And I mean, now I published my stuff. I will make sure that everything can be built from upstream, so it should be a lot less work. Yeah, and the whole SPI flashing setup can be built for less than 30 euro. You can get the laptops under 200 euro on eBay. So there is not really any good excuse to not start building something like this unless you're talking to a CEO who says like, well, I cannot use OS 10 Keynote on this, so I cannot use this. And of course, I want to thank all the COREBOOT people, which includes Google firmware developers. So COREBOOT upstream is also developed by Google employees and so on. And I want to thank Ralph Philipp Weimann for kind of motivating my research here by talking tinfoil hat stuff to me. Yeah, and that's basically it. In terms of future work, what I want to add, TPMs are often known as something very evil that the big companies use to enslave every computer users. But they're actually also really nice devices if you're a tinfoil hat. Because what a TPM can do is you can, every time you load some blob of code in the stage of your boot chain, you can hash that with typically SHA-1 and pass that SHA-1 hash to the TPM. And the TPM will maintain an implicit hash tree of all the hashes, or hash chain rather, of all the hashes that you have given it so far. So if you do that in every stage, and you then load some untrusted stage at some point that has the wrong hash, then your entire hash chain in the TPM will be screwed up. And then you can also ask the TPM to tell me what is the current hash chain, right? So once you boot it in your operating system, you can basically implicitly make sure that the hashes of all the previous stages that were measured match. And you can also even ask the TPM to seal or unseal, which actually means encrypt and decrypt stuff based on the value of these hashes for you. So Matthew Garrett actually did something nice. He used these hashes, which are called stored in the PCRs, the platform control registers, to decrypt TOTP secret, like TOTP, the two-factor authentication time-based codes, you know. So actually by decoding the secret, then your laptop can display you one of these 6-digit numbers, and you can check it on your two-factor authentication app like DualSec or Google Authenticator on your phone. And only if these two numbers match, then you actually know that you booted an entirely trusted chain, right? I mean, this is not like for verification, but for attestation. But then again, like, you know, maybe somebody spied on you really, really hard and knows what your stuff looks like, so you're worried that they flash something that looks like really the same, but then still these numbers wouldn't match. And because it's time-based, it's also not possible to just shoulder surf, right? If I use my laptop here now and somebody sees my secret splash screen, they could mimic the splash screen and flash something like this. But because it's time-based, somebody cannot shoulder surf my secret on my phone and then generate the same, right? And the other thing that needs to be done is auditing of some of the Grub2 modules. As I said, it's a lot of code, and I'm not saying it's bad quality code, but I think Grub, nobody ever saw the reason to audit Grub for security vulnerabilities. But it parses a whole lot of data structures like partition tables and so on from disks, and where you pass a lot of binary and obscure data formats, probably bugs are introduced. And of course, if there's a bug that gives you code execution, then you can circumvent the whole signature checking and so on, right? Yeah, and that's it. Thanks for your attention. And I think we still have some time left for questions, right? I think pretty much on time for the 10 minutes. Yes, Morgan, please.
Yeah, so that was really cool. I have a practical question. Since you said you're like, in addition to your information dominance, you sort of handle the OPSEC and stuff. So you obviously do this with people. So my question is like, how long does it actually take you per laptop? When you do it, does that actually involve like pulling the pins and doing the epoxy and stuff?
It takes about, if you know, I mean, these are really, really easy to open. I prepared for actually showing stuff.
Well done.
All right. Can you see something? Yes.
Ooh, crafty.
Yeah. So you can maybe, yeah, the light sucks. You can see there's some screws here on the bottom. There's of course a warranty void sticker. But all you have to do is unscrew all these screws here, right? And if you unscrew these screws, then you actually can attach the clip to the flash directly. It's just covered by this plastic here. There's nothing additional to remove. So it's easier than replacing the screen or maybe even the memory on some laptops, right? And well, okay, this is not the effect that you want to see, right? The mirror effect. So you remove this here, these screws. I think it's 12 screws, which takes about 1 or 2 minutes. You attach a clip. If you do it in the right, if you don't misrotate it, then you get a good first run. Then it takes about 2 minutes to flash it if you have the binary for this one, right? So I would say overall you can do one laptop if you have done it before in 7 minutes, right? Given that you use the same ROM image to flash there. If you customize a ROM image, like say you at a signing party and you want to give somebody a laptop with his own root signing key, you need to rebuild it, which takes 1 minute. So make it 15 minutes per laptop. So one thing I can actually, this is very technical stuff, right? You cannot go to a journalist and tell them, hey, right, you use GPG now, that's fine, but I don't trust the security of your computer, so start using this now. Doesn't work, right? But when GPG was still obscure, there were these crypto parties where people helped others set up GPG. You can do the same with these laptops, right? Tell somebody, buy this kind of model on eBay, and we set up a meeting, and I will help you guys flash this stuff. So it's very, very practical. And that's why I chose to use the Chromebooks, right? They're actually cheap to get, and it's practical to do. One caveat with the C710. Oh, I forgot a demo. Basically, the talk was a demo because this is one of these laptops, so you can see that they actually work. The C710, it has the flash chip under the keyboard. So if you actually buy one of these OLEDs for upgrading to a larger hard drive or something, you have to disassemble more. That's the only caveat. Then it takes 20 minutes maybe. Yes, please.
Are you willing to say, if you assume the right model of some generic security researcher, what do you think is the weakest link or like the easiest attack vector with this current setup? Or what would you
I don't know. If he's married, set him up with a prostitute and take pictures. And if he's not married, you beat him until he gives you everything you want. It's like, I mean, there's a very famous XKCD comic where somebody's like, oh, I encrypt my disk now. They will never crack my 20-digit passphrase. And the guy with a wrench comes around, right?
So basically, you're saying that the technical isn't the
yeah.
factor anymore.
Morgan said something along these lines, right? They were trying to say, like, we make it so hard to hack us, and now they will just put a gun to somebody's head. Is that something we want, right? In terms of, less James Bond style things, what they could also do is grab a disk image at the border and then put a camera in your hotel room to film how you're actually unlocking your own disk, right? That gives you only a one-time snapshot of data. It doesn't give you persistent access when you're home, but it gives you all the data you had on your laptop while you were traveling, right? So yeah, it also depends on your threat model, right? The thing with the border stuff, I wouldn't necessarily call it bulk collection, but it's very easy to do and widespread to do, right? It's not only done for high-value terrorists, it's done for all kinds of drug traffickers, as we saw in Germany and so on, right? This raises the bar again to the point where they cannot just say, like, everybody crossing a border, we can deploy this on. It makes it a little bit harder again. So actually helps them select more worthwhile targets, I guess. Yes, please.
So you talk about buying used hardware on eBay and Amazon, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, assessment of the actual used hardware. Let's say that some nation state.
Right. I'm not familiar how you're familiar with the Snowden leaks, but they have this awesome project where they actually intercept Apple hardware deliveries if you buy from Apple. If you don't want this, you buy it from eBay, right? Because it's much, much harder for a nation state to intercept something that, A, they don't necessarily know your eBay account and so on if you try to obfuscate it a little bit, and B, they must intercept like a domestic delivery, for example. Like if I buy a Chromebook in Germany, nobody will have thought about this when it was still in the US, right? It is already in Germany, and suddenly it becomes linked to me. So somebody has to intercept it when it is shipped within Germany, right? And of course, this advertisement of the mother selling something of our own son from university could be fake. But I mean, we're refreshing the firmware, we're refreshing the BIOS, we're refreshing a lot. So stuff that's still left in place would have been a hardware implant. So you have to really get unlucky to buy on eBay from a terrorist who actually had a hardware implant in his laptop already, right? So used hardware is in that regard more trustable than fresh hardware, right? It depends on your model again. Please.
You said the FLASHUM, the firmware on all the critical components. Wouldn't it be easier, simpler, just to have a small tool, go through the airport, arrive at your hotel, plug it in, flash everything, and then access your data?
Well, so flashing
the operating system.
Right. Okay. You can do that, but how do you bring your tool across the border? Like on a thumb drive that's encrypted, and you decrypt it on the laptop. And so, I mean, it's kind of like this. It's again practicality versus the hypothetical cryptographically signed chain of trust. If you have it signed already and your private key is home, then you have cryptographic security. If you bring a flash drive, it's very unlikely that somebody has a software implant deployed at the border that will detect your decryption of the flash drive, infect the firmware on the fly, blah, blah, blah. It's very unlikely. It's a different model. It's probably certainly possible too, right? I mean, you can even combine this with approaches. Andreas was talking about USB Armory today, right? Which is nice, but you always need some peripherals, right? So you can start being super paranoid and use one of these secure travel laptops as your peripheral, and then your GPG key, for example, is only stored on the USB Armory, but you also only use the trusted hardware. And again, what you said is just another, diversification of the approach, right? Why not flash it somewhere? Makes sense. And if you flash it while you're in your hotel and I flash it at home, that makes it, again, harder to tackle the approach. More questions? No? Okay. Then we have like 2 minutes left to show you that how it's actually looking to boot. And because I bought actually a demo device and demo presentation. So, okay, it's quick to boot. You can see it. Well, this is grub. You see it's flashing by. This is the kernel booting. And this is asking me for the full disk encryption passphrase, so it actually works. Huh? Oh yeah, I can actually even show you. Wait. As I said, it's a demo device. And it takes, because I'm a friend of high iteration count for the hashing there, okay? And there we go. The focus sucks badly. I don't know if that's, I think it's the refresh rate, which is too high for the camera. So you can actually not read the text. But yeah, so it actually works and it is quick. Trust me, it works. Well, thank you. As I said, I was also I was presenting with PowerPoint Viewer in Wine on a Linux laptop today, which is one of these secure laptops. Okay, thanks, guys.